Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated chess player, and in this series we are going from 1000 to 2000 ELO on chess.com rapid, and during the games I'm going to be explaining my thought process as best as I possibly can for your education and entertainment. If you haven't seen the previous episodes as a speedrun, the playlist will be linked below. But with that being said, we're against Danico6508 from... where is that? Is that Bulgaria? That is Bulgaria. Nice, undefeated in the map game. We have a Caro Kann with my opponent going f4, so of course we'll play d5, and I'm expecting the move e5, which is kind of an What? Well, he's just made me eat my words. Of course we're going to take back. f4 doesn't really make any sense now, because I'll tell you what's going to happen. Okay, well he does this. So I have made a video like 6 months ago, I'm sure. It's weird how chess players remember their games. But I'm sure that my opponent did exactly the same thing. And he ended up putting this pawn on d3. And what ended up happening was that we just got this bishop to c5. And my opponent couldn't castle for the longest time and just got absolutely destroyed as a result of it. Now, in this game, my opponent goes d4. But there's a glaring issue with the move d4 and f4. Well, there's two. Firstly, this bishop can't get out properly because it's locked in by this pawn. Secondly, we are going to control the e4 square very, very nicely, and we're going to start with the move bishop to f5. We could have played knight to f6. I think they're probably interchangeable. We're then going to play e6. We're then probably going to play knight to c6. We'll figure out what we want to do with this bishop, whether we want to put it on e7 or d6. I'm expecting my opponent to maybe adopt a fianchetto setup. Maybe go knight f3, and then after knight f6, maybe try and trade the bishops with bishop to d3. We'll see what he does. But this is a very dubious setup from the white pieces for sure. And you're going to get this when you play any opening. But obviously a large part of my opening expertise is in the Caro Kann defense. And you are going to get people who just play very strange variations against you, and you have to figure out how to exploit them. The move bishop to e3, that's definitely not great. Like, it's just locked in behind both pawns. We're going to go knight to f6, keep developing, and try and gain a time advantage on the clock, because I did take a while with my introduction, but it's not the end of the world. Okay. Well, knight d2 would signify my opponent wants to try and play c4, perhaps, which is an interesting idea. We'll go e6 for now. Now, with c4, we could allow a trade, and we would be giving ourselves an isolated d-pawn, but my opponent would also have an isolated d-pawn, so I don't think that's the end of the world. My opponent can play moves like bishop to b5 check, which I suppose are a little bit annoying because our bishop is now outside the pawn chain and can't help defend. So if we get the chance, we may play a move like a6, but to be honest, we can probably just play knight c6 to block any check, maybe bring our queen to b6 if we're particularly concerned, or rook to c8. But we will be getting castled very soon, so it shouldn't be too big of an issue. Okay, we have the move knight g to f3. Clearly, the intention is to go to the e5 square. I'm still not exactly sure what I want to do with this bishop. Well, the only thing I'm thinking, right, is let's say I play a move like bishop to e7, bishop to b5, knight c6, knight e5, applying pressure to my knight. I suppose there I have queen b6 to put pressure on the bishop and defend, and then I can just castle. And the knight on e5 is a good knight, absolutely, but I think our plan will probably be something like knight to e4 and then f6 to get control over the e5 square. I hope that makes sense. But, oh, do we want to put it on d6? Where would I rather my bishop? I think d6. I think I'd rather have it on d6. Now, if my opponent plays a move like, I don't know, c3 here, then we will just castle. We could have played the move a6, but I don't think that my opponent coming at me too quickly is going to be a good idea for him. And he plays c4, which is kind of what we were expecting. I'm just going to castle. If take, we can take with the knight, actually. And because of the pressure on f4 and the undefended bishop on e3, I think we probably just win a pawn in that variation. My opponent may choose to push the pawn to c5, and in that case, I mean, we probably just drop the bishop back to c7, and this pawn is a little bit weird. It doesn't really do anything that useful because it's not going anywhere. Yeah, he does do it, but I don't think that's a great move. We could drop the bishop back to e7, but then this pawn actually performs the purpose of locking my bishop out of the game. If I put the bishop on c7, then the bishop keeps putting pressure on f4, which I like. You could argue that bishop e7 allows knight e4 and bishop f6, which you could argue is a more active diagonal. You could also argue that bishop c7 blocks the queen from getting out. But personally, I think I prefer this move. Not only because it supports b6 in the future, potentially trying to break the c5 pawn down, but I also just like the pressure on f4. And my opponent goes knight to e5, which was always going to happen at some point. We could play knight to c6. Well, if knight to c6, bishop to b5, I think we have ideas of knight b4 there. Getting in, oh, well, this knight defends there, but we can always take it. Yeah, that looks pretty nice. That does look pretty nice. Let's play knight c6. I think knight to b4 might actually be an issue for my opponent. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, I'd really appreciate it if you haven't already, if you could drop a like and subscribe. It really helps to motivate me to keep up with these daily uploads, because they're a bit of a grind sometimes, a little bit of a grind, but I do like making the videos, absolutely. Bishop e2 is a principled move, just getting ready to castle. I think, yeah, the bishop on b5 isn't great. That's a good move. And, I mean, my opponent's going to castle and he's going to be fine, but we have to try and argue that we have an advantage here, which admittedly isn't the easiest task in the world. Isn't the easiest task. We could play knight to e4, but if like knight e4, bishop f3, then I don't see what we're doing. Although we may have bishop to a5 check ideas. Maybe b6 should be played, although our knight is currently hanging, so we'd have to do something with the knight first. My opponent's maneuvered this pretty well, to be fair, and we'll see after the game whether the computer thinks there were some better plans for black, but I think there should be a long-term structural problem with white's setup here. This doesn't look right to me. And I come to that conclusion just because I've played a lot of chess. Now, knight b5 is still interesting because if my opponent castles, stopping knight c2 check, we can still just go knight c2. And because the bishop's undefended, that's a bit of an issue. I think this is still a good move. I don't really see how white defends. I mean, if rook c1, I think we just take on a2. The rook has to go back to a1. We come back to b4 with the exact same threat. The rook has to return to c1 to block it, if that's his idea, to block. And then we just up a pawn. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Whoa, why is my opponent castled? I think he doesn't realize his bishop hangs. Let's play knight c2. This is just a simple fork, guys. Nothing special. I will show in the analysis like what my opponent could have done to defend himself, but I have a feeling that rook c1 was maybe the only viable move. Pretty dire for white. And I mean, yeah, we're just dominating this diagonal. We'll just hop the knight in, and the fact that the bishop on e3 is undefended is going to be white's downfall. Like I said, all the way back in this position, after bishop e3 was played, I was very skeptical of that move. Did I know exactly how I was going to exploit it? No, absolutely not. But I recognized that it was a weakness, and as the game went on, it just proved to be vulnerable. It just proved to be a vulnerable piece. And it's one of the reasons why I felt like I had some kind of advantage in this position. Because, for example, that bishop was clearly misplaced on the e3 square. Now, what should my opponent have done with that bishop? I don't know. I don't know. Because it is a bad piece. Because of the pawns being like this, it is just a bad piece. It might have made more sense to try and play b3, bishop a3 to try and trade off for my bishop, like kind of like a French idea, where black normally does that with his bishop coming out to a6. My opponent defends the bishop, so of course we will take the rook. And now I have no issues taking this knight, because white kind of fixes his pawn structure, but it doesn't matter because we are up, what, an exchange. Also, we have the move knight to g4 in some lines, going after the bishop. I mean, right now, if knight g4, knight takes, bishop takes, then we skewer the rook and the bishop, and we get more trades. If we take the knight first, then after something like takes knight g4, the bishop can escape to a square like f4. If knight g4, the bishop can't move anywhere to save itself, which is why I'm calculating this variation. Now, we shouldn't necessarily be too quick to make trades. We don't want to just trade for the sake of trading necessarily. But it does look pretty nice to start getting pieces off the board because the center's very clogged up, which makes it difficult for my rooks to get into the game. Because of course we're up in exchange. But I think if we can trade pieces off, then moves like b6 might become easier to play, or we might be able to lift our rook like this somehow. I think that makes sense to me. I think I like the move knight g4. So I'm going to play it. We're going to go after the bishop. And we're trying to just facilitate trades here. For the moment, we're keeping our very nice light squared bishop off there on the board, helping alongside my pawns to control the light squares in the center. The game is definitely not over yet, so don't like click away thinking, oh, Chess Centurion's up a piece, he's against a 1500 rated player. This is game over. It really isn't game over. It isn't, because although I don't think this pawn structure is good for white, white clearly has a space advantage with this move c5. It makes it difficult for me to activate my pieces. Furthermore, I am only up an exchange. Although that's obvious, like if it came down to rook versus bishop and pawn endgame, like if all the pawns stayed on the board and everything got traded off except either rook and my opponent had a bishop, yes, I would be winning in the vast majority of cases, but that isn't what the situation is on the board. The situation on the board is I'm up material, but my pieces aren't all that active. That's the situation. I think, yeah, I've got to take this. I don't want to allow any bishop h6 ideas in the future. My opponent takes with the rook. We could take this knight, certainly. We could also play the move f6 to kick the knight out, which actually looked really good because the f4 pawn will hang. Pawn knight e3, holding on to the f4 pawn. Takes, if bishop takes, we take on f4, skewer the rook and the knight. If f6, knight d3 takes, rook takes, we take on f4, attacking the knight. Something like knight f3. I think we even have ideas of e5, maybe. But if nothing else, we can just drop our bishop back. So we facilitate more trades, and we get a pawn, and we get rid of this annoying knight, which I do like. One of the things that's definitely going in our favor right now is the fact that this queen is completely out of the game. And yeah, it could get into the game quite easily with like queen e1, queen g3, or queen e1, queen h4. But it's going to take a couple moves for white to do that. And in the meantime, we can start to take the game to white, try and facilitate some trades, and try and expose the weakness of this pawn structure. It is a weak pawn structure at the end of the day. And f6 should be a move that's on your mind in like how do I even phrase this? It should just be a move that's on your mind because this is a strong knight, and we don't really want to take. We don't really want to take because after a move like f takes e5, my opponent's going to start shifting his pieces over to the king side, and it might be difficult for us to defend. Because if you are starting an attack, the general advice is to keep the center closed, so it becomes difficult to transport defending pieces over to the side they need to defend on. My opponent plays g4, which is a move I was kind of expecting, but I think I can just take on e5, which was my idea in response. Let me think a second. Pawn takes, my opponent has to take. Let me think. Pawn f4, rook e6. We could even give a check on yeah, that looks completely winning. Let's just take. There's so many different captures that can happen in this position, but at the end of the day, I'm taking a knight, which forces my opponent to take here. And I am 100% sure this is completely winning. We could even consider the move e4, actually. That actually looks like a really nice move. I like that a lot. Yeah, I think I really like that move. Let's play it. Because what this move does is it shuts the e-file down completely. It opens up my bishop to the weak f4 pawn. We're also threatening to take the f5 pawn. And if we can take... Well, actually, probably not. I'd like to take with the rook, but then bishop g4 ideas are annoying. So we could even just take with the pawn, play g6, and have this monster chain of pawns in the center, which would be really nice. And f4 would still be weak. F4 would still be weak. The reason that I didn't play something like e takes f4 is just because things get a little bit complicated after like rook e6. Maybe we would give a check on g5 and take on f5. And I mean, the position's completely winning. It may even be more winning. I'm not sure. But I feel like the move e4 just stops so many of my opponent's ideas. Because not only are we reducing the amount of possibilities that can happen, therefore reducing the chance that we could be messing it up by missing something really subtle, right? If there's only so many things white can do, then there's less things for us to potentially miss, if you get what I'm saying. Here, we stop the knight from coming to f3, which is where the knight wants to go to get into the game. We cut the rook off from the e-file, where it's quite active. We shut down this diagonal forever, which this bishop would love to go to. We open up our bishop, keep our rook open, our queen is still open. If the pawn on e6 falls, it doesn't matter. We just take on f4. This pawn's not going anywhere. And we just try and keep our opponent completely locked out of the game. I think that the computer may think that taking on f4 is the best move, and to an engine, it might be. But it's a lot more complicated than this approach. Let me know down in the comments what you would have done in this position. I mean, would you have taken on f5 with the pawn or the rook? Would you have taken on f4? Would you have taken on d4? Would you have played the move that I played, e4? Let me know in the comments which one, and let me know why. Actually have a good think about the position, because I don't know what the correct answer is, like genuinely, because I haven't analysed it yet. And we will find out in the analysis what the quote-unquote correct line is. But from a practical perspective, I like the move e4. And my opponent has sunk into quite a deep think here. He probably wasn't expecting this move because, to be fair, I didn't see this move until we actually got to the position. I'd only considered taking. And I saw that and I was like, yeah, we're good there, we're good. So I went for the line. But then once we got here, I then realized the move e4 looks more appealing to me. Opponent's really taking his time here thinking, which is good for us because we are now up on the clock, which is certainly a rarity on the Chess Centurion channel. I also just want to say a massive thank you for the recent support on the videos. It's been really humbling, like the comments some of you guys leave, like saying that I've been really helpful or whatnot. It genuinely means a lot, so I really do appreciate that. I'm really enjoying making YouTube videos, even if daily uploads can be a little bit of a stress sometimes. I'm kind of putting off doing a university essay right now because I've got to get a video up for you guys tomorrow. It's an interesting essay, to be fair, but I figure it's pretty easy, so it shouldn't be too tough. I should be fine on that. Still thinking my opponent. I'm not concerned about any like taking on e4 ideas. He plays rook b3. That's interesting. I didn't consider that move. I mean, b7 is weak, yeah, absolutely, but I think we can just take on f4, attacking the knight. I don't think we need to think too hard about this. Yeah, let's just take. The knight's under attack, so you can't play rook to b7. This pawn is hanging, and this pawn is hanging, and this pawn is hanging, and this pawn is hanging. But the knight is also hanging, which is the biggest problem in the position. So that is what white needs to address. Now, the knight can't come forward at all because of the pawn structure in the center. Like I said, our pawn structure in the center is very healthy. So knight b1, of course, can't be played because you lock the queen in. So either white plays something like knight to f1, which also has the benefit of guarding the h2 square, which could be quite useful, and or he plays a move like queen to e1 or queen to d1, defending the knight. My opponent takes on e4. Okay, well that's... wow, interesting. We're of course just going to take. There's nothing to that move. If anything, it just helps us because it opens up our queen to the d4 square. And we obviously just go up a knight. Yeah, you win the b7 pawn, but I don't care. I'm going to take on d4 with check. I could have taken the f pawn, but I'm going to take this pawn first. King h1. I mean, two pawns are hanging here. I think the f pawn is definitely the priority because it's not only attacking the e6 pawn, but also the c pawn isn't going anywhere. You may be concerned about it pushing down the board, and initially I was thinking it might be a little bit scary, but I don't think it is. Simply because we control the c8 square so well. We can just play a move like rook c8 and pick it up very easily. Now, what do we want to do in this position? Well, we could ignore both pawns. We could play a move like queen to f2, threatening checkmate, and threatening the bishop. If queen to f2, I think white's only move is queen to g1, defending mate and also counter-threatening mate. So if queen f2, queen g1, don't take the bishop and blunder checkmate in one. But yeah, queen f2 I think just kills the game immediately because queen g1 has to be played. And then we just take. We could even give a check and win the c5 pawn, but I think it makes more sense to take on f5, probably with the pawn so our pawns can march up together. This looks like the most accurate move to me in the position. Just having a quick scan. Also, be aware of this alignment on the g7 pawn. Something like b3 would threaten mate, but of course we would be mating our opponent first. If queen f2, rook g7 needs to be considered. After king to g7, a move like b3 would deliver a check, but that's fine because we have e5, and there are many other moves to defend the position. A move like rook f6, I'm sure, defends the diagonal and kills white's chances, but e5 clearly indicates to me that this diagonal is shut down forever and we have nothing to worry about. So queen f2 is the move I'm going to choose. Initially, I was considering queen to d2, but of course, threatening mate and threatening the bishop is a far better option. So of course, we're going to take. And then we're going to take, and this game is, well, pretty much done. I mean, don't hang a rook on f7, I suppose. Like, yeah, okay, I suppose my opponent does have a passed pawn here, but I think I actually like this maneuver, maybe? Or maybe just go rook c8. Maybe with this rook. Maybe with this rook. Let me think 1 second. Yeah. After bishop to c4 check, king f8 poses a couple of problems because white either wins a pawn on g7, which is a little bit annoying, and then maybe the f5 pawn and the e4 pawn fall, which isn't ideal. Or of course, if you go back to f8, then there are discovered checks. Or actually, no, taking on f5 with discovered check is probably better. But if bishop to c4, it makes more sense to play king to h8, just tucking the king away. Our opponent doesn't do that. He plays rook to b5, which attacks our f5 pawn. And we could just take, and after take, drop the bishop back. Or actually, no, we have rook to f8. We could also give a check on e3. We could play the move g6 to just defend the pawn. Oh, my opponent can't defend on c5 because of this check. So yeah, that's what we're going to do. I have a feeling our opponent might play rook c5 to try and hang on to the pawn, because that's his only move to defend the pawn. And then hopefully we'll blunder this bishop e3 check, and then the game should be pretty much wrapped up. There we go. There we go. He does blunder it, and maybe he saw it but was just hoping that I wouldn't see it. That wouldn't be too unrealistic. But I hope you guys enjoyed the game. Make sure you stick around for the analysis, because it's going to be pretty interesting. So, a very solid, what was it, 90.9% accuracy. And there's actually 3 great moves in this game from us, and they were all in a row. I'll let you guys guess which they were, if you can. But my opponent starts with e4. We go c6, of course, going for the Caro Kann, and f4 is played. Now, f4 is a move. And after d5, I was expecting the move e5, and then we have some kind of setup like this, and you get kind of a traditional Caro Kann. The pawn will probably go to d4, and white has like maybe an interesting move order of an advanced Caro Kann, because I can't play c5 as quickly as I would normally like to in an advanced setup. But my opponent takes on d5, which is just not a good move. The best move here is apparently d3. And after de4, de4, queen d1, queen d1, knight f6. I don't know if I'd want to play this with white. I mean, you don't even have to take there. You could just, I don't know, play a move like e6 and wait for white to do something with his pawns in the center, because this pawn is clearly misplaced on the d3 square. Really, the bishop should be going to d3 in most lines. But my opponent takes. Of course, we take with the pawn. You shouldn't be taking with the queen here, because you're just getting a weird version of the Scandinavian, which isn't great. And if you wanted to play the Scandinavian, why didn't you just play it on move 1? So take with the pawn, obviously. d4. Which the computer, like, it says it's fine, but the issue is, like, bishop f5, bishop e3 is just not a good move. It's just a bad move. Let's say my opponent plays it in a more principled manner, with, like, knight to f3, e6. It's difficult to know what to do with this pawn. I was expecting something like this, where my opponent tries to trade off the bishops. And whilst the computer likes the idea of going for this structure, for black, the difference being, in my eyes, that we've both got pawns on like d5, d4, f4, and f5, right? But let's just say the knights both jump into their desired squares. I always have this f6 move at some point. Not yet, because I think we just lose to queen h5, check, g6, take, take, take. But at some point, like, let's say, I don't know, we just develop our pieces normally-ish, and c3, and then a move like f6 the computer likes, just booting the knight away, and we have this stronghold on e4 because my opponent's pawns are far forward. But because we have this pawn on f6, because we have doubled pawns are actually useful in this position, we can kick our opponent out of e5. So I hope that makes sense as to why the computer would suggest to do something like that. I do often struggle to double my pawns like this, though, to get this kind of Pillsbury knight sort of thing. So I may have taken on d3, or maybe dropped the bishop back. I may have gone for this e takes f5 setup, but we'll never know. We'll never know because my opponent played bishop to e3, which is just categorically a bad move. Not just because of this maneuver leaving the bishop in trouble, but the bishop, what is it doing there? Like, you're defending d4. I'm not attacking d4. You don't need to defend it because this knight's going to come to f3 anyway, giving you two defenders of the d4 square. Realistically, I could attack it twice, maybe three times. Just play c3. You could just play c3 and my entire plan is in the bin if I go after this pawn. Because I can't play a move like c5 to undermine the pawn, like you typically do in advanced Caro Kann setups. And I clearly can't play e5 because white controls that square way too well. So the move bishop to e3 makes no sense. Just doesn't make any sense. I go knight to f6. Apparently queen b6 is better, targeting the weak b2 pawn. And I suppose it's difficult to trap my queen because I can always take on c2 with the support of my bishop. And the best idea for white is putting the bishop back on c1, which is a bit brutal, But we go knight f6, which of course makes sense. Knight d2 is played by my opponent. Again, a strange move. A move like bishop d3 makes far more sense, trying to challenge my strong bishop on f5, because we saw what happened when my opponent didn't challenge the bishop on f5. It allowed the knight to get in and target the weak c2 square. Knight d2 is played. And I assumed my opponent wanted to go for pawn to c4. That's what that move indicated to me. Now the best move here is knight g4, going after the bishop. And after bishop to f2, queen b6, again targeting this pawn, knight b3, knight c6. And I suppose black has a decent initiative here. But because I'm unfamiliar with the position, I kind of just wanted to keep things relatively simple. So I played e6, which is still a good move. Knight g to f3, bishop d6, c4. Now c4 surprised me. Like, I knew that knight d2 signaled the move c4, sorry, but I thought it made more sense for my opponent to give a check on b5. Knight e5 is also the best move for white, but this made a lot of sense to me, and I thought, well, if my opponent goes for this, I'll play queen b6, the computer likes this, and then maybe c4 makes sense. Because the bishop's now defended, you put pressure on the center, and if I take, you could take first and then do this, and the position is playable for white. Now it's playable. But c4 straight away kind of misses the point of the position for white, because you have control over e5, and you have this diagonal, which my bishop coming out and locking itself out of the pawn chain weakens. So you should probably try and take advantage of it. But c4 is played, and you should never be taking here, really, because you're just helping your opponent develop. And yes, the d pawn is isolated, but by trading off this pawn, we also lose control over the crucial e4 square. So I wouldn't really recommend doing that. Again, the computer likes knight to g4, but it also likes castling. My opponent goes c5, which is the best move, but it makes it really difficult for white to come up with plans, because bishop c7, which is better than bishop to e7, for the reasons that I highlighted during the game. And now knight e5, the computer doesn't love it, but I can't really blame my opponent for playing it. A move like g3 might make more sense, making sure the f4 pawn is stable. But this bishop is never seeing the light of day if g3 is played. I mean, it never really saw the light of day anyway. But it maybe makes more sense to try and put the bishop on g2, although my bishop is so strong. So strong. So my opponent plays knight e5, which I can't really blame him for. I go knight c6, which is the first of the three great moves in the position. The issue is, if my opponent takes and takes, you might think that, okay, white gets rid of this threat, and then he just plays. Yeah, how is he going to play? Like, how are you developing here? If you play a move like knight to f3, I have checks here. And if you try and block, rook b8, rook b1 can't be played because of the bishop. If b3 is played, for example, knight e4, and this is completely dire. Like, how are you supposed to defend yourself? My pieces really come to life in this position. Queen c3 is, yeah, pretty nasty. pretty nasty. Very bad position for white. So you can't take on c6 because this is your best piece. And the difference is, after bishop e2, which makes sense, if I take on e5, watch that eval bar drop. Watch it drop. Minus 1.4, 1.3. And if I take, white is better, slightly. Because white takes with the f-pawn, and you might think, well, we have control over the e4 square. Yeah, but so what? Okay, here we have bishop to a5, but let's say castles a6, bishop f3. White is better. We've gone from being winning to worse in the space of a few moves. Because our bishop's locked out of the game, and we're just trading all of our best pieces. Don't trade your best pieces. This knight is really nice for white, but taking is bad. It opens up this bishop. When my opponent castles, it opens up the rook. It forces my knight to move. And what I was saying earlier in the game about if you're trying to start an attack, you should try and lock the center shut. That is achieved for white if I do this. White can now start an attack with his bishops pointing towards my king. Oh my god. His rook will be pointing towards my king. His queen. He could even transfer his knight into f3 if he really wanted to, but it makes more sense to take. And like the computer thinks I need to go f6 quickly to try and break out of this position, because if I don't, the position sucks. Knight b4 though is better. And yes, I was correct. Rook c1 is the only move. The issue is that this is a threat and you can't stop it, because bishop d3 or knight d3 can't be played because I control this square twice, and the knight on d2 blocks the queen's control. We saw what happens if you castle. King f2 is interesting, defending the bishop and stopping this from coming with a check. Here, I do have bishop c2, which I did see. If queen c1, take, knight g4 check, the bishop can't take because knight d3 wins the queen. So if like king g1, then we just win this. And if the king moves up, then we still take, and then bring the queen in, and then we're obviously completely winning here. Rook c1 has to be played. And after knight a2, the rook has to go back, because it has no other safe squares. And then I come back, again threatening knight c2, so the rook has to go back to c1. And then, I'm not sure what the follow-up is here. The computer likes knight e4, it also likes taking on e5, something like this. Knight g4, okay. And if take, then what? Oh, queen h4 check. And then what? We're just up a pawn, but we have a really dominant position. Really dominant position, because the difference between our positions, right, is we're only up a pawn. All of white's pawns are on dark squares. Most of our pawns are on light squares. And we have a light squared bishop. White has a dark squared bishop. The problem is, our bishop is outside of the pawn chain. So it's really active. It can control some really useful diagonals. My opponent's bishop, however, is inside of the pawn chain. And there's no obvious way outside of the pawn chain for my opponent's bishop. His pawns are restricting his bishop. Whereas my bishop is not restricted by my pawns because it's already outside of the pawn chain. I hope that makes sense. That's a big idea of the Caro Kann, overplaying like a French structure. And you can see here the absolute massive difference between the bishops, not to mention the fact that my knight is an incredible piece, so rook to c3 probably has to be played. And the game goes on, but black is much better. My opponent castles though, and of course you have to go knight to c2. Attack the bishop, attack the rook. My opponent plays rook f3, which I thought was quite creative actually. You defend the bishop and you prepare to lift the rook to the g3 square to maybe cause me some problems. Knight a1, queen a1. And here knight g4 is the best move, so I'm really happy that I found that, because the game is certainly not over. If I play a lazy move like, I don't know, a6, we lose not all of our advantage, of course, but we do lose a bit of our advantage. Time is kind of the essence, because this queen can maybe try and get into the game. We need to find this knight g4 idea, and We attack the knight, we attack the bishop, the knight is under attack. This is a great position for us. My opponent plays rook g3, which is not great. Now, there are different possibilities in this position. If knight g4, bishop g4, we skewer the rook and the bishop. The computer wants to play bishop to d3 and sack the rook, but that's never going to happen ever. So if a move like rook f2 defending the bishop, we can just take. And this rook has gone from being a very powerful piece to a very timid piece looking at nothing. And now we can start bringing our pieces out with like queen f6, we threaten f4, g3 defends, and then b6 trying to break out of the position. If take, we have eyes on d4, we have the c file opening up. Of course, white doesn't want to take on b6 for those reasons, so maybe a move like b4 could be played. But this is still great for black, apparently. We get the b file in this situation, so it's really good. Really, really good. Therefore, my opponent goes rook g3, which makes sense. But after knight e3, rook e3, we find the crucial move in this position. Yes, you can take on e5, and we're still winning, but we lose a whole point of advantage. After like fe5, queen g5, knight f1 defending the rook, because if you move the rook, then I'll take your knight, and you don't have rook d3 because of bishop d3. So knight f1 defending, and the position is dire. Absolutely dire for white. Like bishop e4, rook g3, queen e7. We are going to have to play f6 at some point to break apart white's structure and get our rooks involved in the game. But you can see that white is a bit more active in this position. Maybe he gets his queen involved, and maybe it's a little bit annoying. What we did, though, is we find f6. And white is running out of options. If the knight retreats to f3, we take on f4. This rook is in really not a good position, right? At rook b3, we do have these e5 moves, which I mentioned during the game. And our bishops have suddenly come to life, and white's center is falling apart. The b7 pawn doesn't really matter because, like, e4 and the knight is going to hang. It's really not good. Now, my opponent plays the move g4, which I thought was interesting. Knight d3 is the best move here, and is the move I was expecting, defending the f4 pawn. Here, I was intending bishop d3. You don't want to take with the bishop because of bishop f4 skewering, something like this here. And I can take on d2, but again, this e5 move I really liked the look of. Trying to open up lines. If something like takes, the f-file now opens up for me. I've got connected passed pawns in the center of the board. Beautiful position. So more likely, rook takes d3, but still bishop f4. And if a move like knight to f3, you block your rook's ability to go over to the king side, and e5 happens all the same. Something like takes. If you try a move like g3, I just have e4 counter-striking. And it's a beautiful position. But my opponent chooses g4, which, to be fair, is very interesting. And it kind of forces our hand, right? We have to take. And do we think that my idea was the best here? After gf5, there's so many possibilities. e4 is the best. I did not know that during the game, obviously, but it looked like the simplest move to me. Now, my initial thought was maybe I take on f4, and after like rook e6, I have queen g5, which the computer does really like. This is a nice position, absolutely. But e4 is the best move, and I really liked this because we keep all the good parts about our position. The fact that we can get into the game, the open f-file, the hanging f-pawn, but we also restrict the rook, restrict the knight, restrict the bishop. So we have all the benefits of the position, and white has even less. He has even less to work with. I really like playing chess in this manner. I personally consider it like positional aggression, kind of like a boa constrictor sort of game style. I really like playing like that, and I really do try to adopt that play style as much as I can. My opponent goes rook b3. I mean, there's not much he can do. I was expecting something like taking on e6, but just bishop f4, and what's white doing? His rook's hanging. The rook can't move in a way that defends the knight, so realistically, there's nothing good here. If like Queen F1 defending the F4 pawn, just take. Or I could even take with the E pawn if I really want. And after something like Rook H3, I don't know, G6, this isn't the most accurate line, but my pawns completely lock his pieces out of the game. They can't do anything. And I'm the only one with a dark squared bishop, and this is one weak pawn on the F4 square. Rook B3 is played. We take on F4, attacking the knight. My opponent has to respond. Now, he did end up sacking the knight. Knight F1 is clearly the best move. And here, I mean, we can take on F5, and if take on B7, we probably have some kind of attack brewing here. It's really bad. It's really bad for white. But my opponent takes on E4. We take, Rook B7, Queen D4 check. And this isn't the best line. Actually, Queen H4 is better, eyeing up H2 immediately. And we apparently have mate in 6. Maybe I should have seen this, to be fair. Maybe some of you were screaming at your... Where do you guys even watch this, actually? Is it like on phones, laptops, TVs? I have no idea. I should check my analytics, but I actually can't figure out how they work. But King H1 is essentially forced. And Queen F2, the computer doesn't think is the best move, but it keeps things simple. After Queen G1, we just trade, and after EF5, C6, Rook F to C8, the only thing we're going to be careful of is don't play King F8. It's still winning. Don't do something like this and give your bishop up, because it's winning, but it's way more complicated than it needs to be. My opponent doesn't go for it. If this was played, I was just going to go King to H8, keep things nice and simple. He goes Rook to B5, and I set a trap with the move G6. Could I have taken on C6? Absolutely. I didn't really want to give up this pawn if I could help it, though. I thought that G6, and there's an incredibly high chance that my opponent plays Rook C5 blundering this, which of course he did. And there's a good chance that he actually saw this move of mine, but was hoping that I didn't see it. Because if he doesn't defend this pawn, the game is so over. It's already over, but like, there's nothing left now. Once that pawn falls, my opponent has nothing. So that's the game. My opponent blunders his rook. We play bishop e3 check. My opponent resigns. That's the Caro Kann in action, punishing a very dubious line from my opponent. And we just have a great game. We found this very nice knight maneuver to win us an exchange. A really, really interesting maneuver. My opponent doesn't deal with it properly. And then we convert the middle game into a winning endgame really smoothly. Look for your candidate moves. Calculate, calculate, calculate. Look for what you can play. Which one is the best, which one is the simplest. Don't just find a good move and play it. Look at all the moves. Thank you very much for watching. Check out this video that appears here for another really cool Caro Kann game.